Okie dokie. So here we go. We're going to talk about the closing of the West today, which happens the exact same time period as the Indian Wars take place, right after the Civil War. So, right after the Civil War, there's this renewed push, this renewed interest in moving west, which, as we know from last time, led to this increase in Native American conflicts. As we began to move west, we came in contact with more and more American Indians, leading to a number of very violent clashes. So we talked about how this played out for the Native Americans last time. Today, we're going to talk about just what it looked like as people were moving west, what the reasons why they moved west, how they moved west, and some of the fallout that takes place as they move west. So today, the closing of the West, 1865 to 1890. So during the Civil War, there's two different major laws that are passed that are meant to help people move west, to interest people to move west, to entice them to move west. One of these laws that's passed is called the Morrill Land Grant Act, and it's passed in 1862. So what it does is that all of this land that the government owns in the West, and the government owns almost all of the land in the West, it allowed some of that government land to be sold off. 30,000 acres total of land to be sold off to various settlers and various entities, railroads, and so on. That money was then going to be used to invest into agricultural colleges because it became very, very apparent the further west you went from the Mississippi River, the more dry the environment became, the less moisture there was. The soil was not as rich or as fertile as it was in the Mississippi or the Ohio River valleys. And if people are going to move out there, move out into the West, into this very arid, sandy soil, they're going to have to learn how to use the soil, how to farm. It's an entirely different farming method than it is back east. So the money from from the 30,000 acres that are sold off, the money is going to be used for the building, for the investment and the creation of agricultural colleges who are going to figure out how to grow things here. And then in turn, teach that to the settlers as they move west. And there's a number of different colleges that are created out of this. Colorado State is the college here that's created out of the Morrill Land Grant. Any college that has A&M, Texas A&M, Colorado State used to be Colorado A&M. A&M stands for Agriculture and Military. So it's a school that focuses on agriculture, but they also have, military. It's a military base, and they do some training for the Army there. So Texas A&M, Colorado State A&M, there's any number of these colleges that are created out of this. And their main focus, Colorado State's main focus still today, is agriculture and how to use this land and then teach the settlers how to use this land. Originally, if you looked at early maps of the United States going back to, say the founding of the country, back to the colonial period, this area of the country that we live in, this West out here, the American Southwest, was known as the Great American Desert. And it was believed nobody could ever live there because the soil and the conditions were so harsh and so bad. So there you go. That's one of the laws that's passed during the Civil War to encourage people to move west. They're going to build colleges to figure out how best to use this land, what can be grown here, and how you grow it. The other law that's passed is known as the Homestead Act, and it's also passed in 1862. So what it does is it takes a lot of this land that the government owns, and it divides it up into 160-acre plots of land. 160-acre plots of land was the average size of a lot that you needed for an individual, for a family, to grow food to support themselves, as well as have room for grazing for animals. So 160-acre plots of land is going to be divided up in the West. All you had to do was show up on the land and make improvements to the land. You had to build some sort of permanent structure like a house. You couldn't live out of your wagon or live out of a tent or something like that. You had to build a structure that showed you intended on staying there. And then you had to do things to the land. You had to improve the land. You had to grow food, or so on and so forth, which goes back to the moral land grant, right? They're learning how to grow food there. If you did these things and you lived there for 5 years, you would get title to that land for free. For free! It was great. It was a great deal, right? Because that's why people kept moving west. They were looking for land. And this is an opportunity to own 160 acres of land, and you get it for free. It was a great deal. It was very enticing for settlers moving west. And you can see in the photograph there's some homesteaders. They're in front of their house. They have the permanent structure. And, they've got the whole family out for the photograph there. So this was another act that was passed during the Civil War to entice people to move further west. Now, there were other reasons why people moved west. People are moving west for opportunities to own land. People are moving west for economic opportunities, the gold rush, and so on. There were other reasons why people moved west, and this is probably the greatest example or most famous example of why people moved west, other than economic and land and opportunity. There's a group who is looking to move west for refuge, for protection, for safety reasons. Okay? The Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, or Mormons. This is a new Christian religion that's founded in New York by Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith is he's a devout Christian. He's working in New York at a time, living in New York. And Smith claims that an angel of God by the name of Moroni came to him and led him to this area where he found these golden pages. And written on the golden pages was a new book for the Bible. Like you have the book of Daniel and the book of Exodus and the book of Revelations and the book of Luke and so on and so forth. This is a new book for the Bible to be added to the Bible. And the Book of Mormon, it's called the Book of Mormon. In the Book of Mormon, this is an account of prophets who are talking about the appearance of Jesus Christ appearing in the Americas shortly after his resurrection, and there's accounts of him visiting the American Indians and so on and so forth. So this is an addition to the Bible. This is called the New Book, the Book of Mormon, and it's supposed to be an addition to the Bible, and it's an account of the appearance of Jesus Christ in the Americas. Now, there were many things about this new Mormon religion that were very unusual and didn't sit well with regular practicing Christians. They didn't believe in alcohol. They were teetotalers. They didn't take alcohol. They believed that went against the word of God. They didn't partake in tobacco. They believed in the worst thing maybe that they believed in that made them the most targeted was that they believed in polygamy, that a man should be able to, and a man is supposed to have, more than one wife. So because of these very weird beliefs that didn't fit in with traditional Christianity, Mormons become a target for a number of attacks. There's constantly being attacked and being chased out of town. And so the Mormons begin to travel west, looking for this promised land, believing that God was going to lead them to a promised land. Very much like the old story, the old biblical story of Moses being led into the desert by God to find a new promised land. Mormons believe that they're on the same track as they're heading west, looking for this promised land, and they're being led by the hand of God. Now, everywhere they go, they meet resistance, they meet violence, they meet anger. They go to Ohio, they're chased out of Ohio. They go to Missouri, and then they go to Illinois. And finally, they reach to the present day Utah. At that time, Utah was so far removed from American civilization, right? There's not any American civilization out there. There's really not any American government presence out there. That the Mormons believe this is where God led us to. They find this oasis in the desert, Salt Lake, and they believe this is where God led us to. And they settle down in the Salt Lake region and begin practicing their religion as they see fit. Now, in Illinois, Joseph Smith was killed by a band of angry people who were not happy with the Mormon religion. So Joseph Smith is killed, and the leadership of this group then in Illinois is assumed by Brigham Young, and he's the one that ultimately leads them to present-day Utah. Now, when it comes time later on, many years later, when it comes time for Utah to join the Union, Utah wanted to become a part of the United States. The United States basically told Utah, the price for your statehood is that you have to ban polygamy. And the Mormons did. The Mormon church did come out and say polygamy is wrong, and they banned that you cannot have more than one wife. Now, there are some break-off sects of the Mormon church that have gone to various areas of very remote Arizona, Utah, and even in Colorado who still practice polygamy. But the official Mormon church, the official line of the Mormon church is no more polygamy. So this is an example of a group that headed west, not necessarily for economic betterment or opportunity or the chance to own land. They were heading west to be allowed to practice their society as they saw fit. All right, as people head west, the greatest technological innovation of its day, the railroad follows them. Between 1865 to 1890, the railroad construction boomed. I mean, it just blew across the United States. Right? If you looked at a map of the United States, say around 1890, and looked at all of the number of different railroad lines that are just ballooning throughout the United States, it would look like varicose veins. They're just all over the place in the West. Between 1865, there's 35,000 miles of track laid total across the United States. Now we get to 1890, there's 200,000 miles of railroad track. Woof! That's a huge expansion from 35 to 200,000 in 25 years. Now, this is how the railroad expansion was really financed to a large degree. The government during this time definitely saw the need for railroads to expand to help bring people out west, help bring supplies out west, help begin to settle the West. The government recognized that this was really, really important that they get the railroad out there. However, the government really didn't have the money to finance this. So what the government would do is they would go to the railroads and they would tell the railroads, as far as you can see to your left and as far as you can see to your right, all of that land is yours. The government had a lot of land. That was something the government did have a lot of. And then that land would be sold off either by the government or usually by the railroad. That land would be sold off to speculators and to farmers and to ranchers. And then that money would be used to finance the building of the railroad. Okay. Obviously, the closer you were to the railroad, the more valuable the land was because now you had access to the railroad moving stuff in and out of the area. There were towns that began to build up along the railroad. The further out you get from the railroad, the less expensive that land gets. But they could sell off all of this land. As soon as a railroad was coming through, the land in that area gets much more valuable, so it's more expensive. And that's how the financing of the railroad is done. Okay. Now, the railroad does come in and it saves a lot of boom towns that sprung up during the mining booms, saves them from becoming a ghost town, because what was happening is you have all these towns and all of a sudden there's a gold strike or a silver strike in the area, and a flood of settlers come into the area to find their fortune and strike it rich and so on and so forth. Usually they didn't. And then they would just pack up and leave and go somewhere else to the next gold strike or the next silver strike, right? So this boom town, a town that just blew up out of nowhere, boom town, this boom town, all of a sudden, as people began to move to the next latest, greatest gold strike, that boom town suddenly began to shrink and was on the verge of becoming a ghost town. If the railroad came through your town, it would save your town, because now you've got new money and you've got new people and supplies coming through your town, and that could save your town. And the railroad did save a lot of towns from becoming ghost towns out on the west. One of these towns is Denver. Oh, great story. Okay, so here we go. So Denver is this boom town that suddenly springs up at the base of the Rocky Mountains during the gold strikes in Colorado. And Denver at one time was a fairly large Western city, but over time, gold strikes had dwindled, and people were not coming into Denver, but they were going to other places where there were other gold and silver strikes. And Denver was rapidly losing thousands of people a month, and Denver was on the verge of becoming a ghost town. Oof. And then there's talk about the Transcontinental Railroad that's being built by the federal government. The federal government has contracted two railroad companies, to build a transcontinental railroad that will connect the Pacific and the Atlantic side of the country together by a railroad. So Denver is very excited about this, right? That if we could get the Transcontinental Railroad to come through Denver, that'll save us. That'll be our economic savior. So the town fathers, the town leaders in Denver at that time, bring in executives from the railroad to look at Denver, at the possibility of bringing the Transcontinental Railroad through Denver. And they come out and they look and they, see what's here. And then they decided to run the Transcontinental Railroad through Cheyenne, 90 miles north of Denver. Why would they do that? If you said mountains, you're right. Right? So the guys from the Transcontinental Railroad show up in Denver and they look west and they go, holy smoky, those are some huge mountains out there that we've got to get through. And then they go 90 miles west to Cheyenne and they look west and they go, not as big, not as many mountains. We're going to go through Cheyenne. That's easier. So now Denver is completely bypassed by the Transcontinental Railroad. So the town leaders, not to be stopped, still looking for a way to get railroad traffic into Denver, they pool their money together and they make a spur line railroad. So a spur line is a smaller railroad that connects into a larger railroad, right? So it's just a very small track of train track. So they create their own railroad, and it's going to be a spur line that's going to connect into the Transcontinental Railroad. And it'll go from the Transcontinental Railroad in Cheyenne down to Denver. They call this spur line the Denver Rio Grande Railroad, hoping that maybe they can get some traffic coming off of the Transcontinental Railroad as it goes through Cheyenne. Luckily, just as this is built, there's another gold strike, this time in just outside of Denver in Golden. And there's Denver is now a new attraction again. People are beginning to flood into Denver again because of this new gold strike. And because of this spur line, the Denver Rio Grande Railroad. Now, all of a sudden, getting to Denver becomes much easier, and Denver is saved as a result of this. Oh, who knew? I mean, think of this. Like, if they hadn't created this spur line, the Denver Rio Grande Railroad, if they hadn't done this and Denver just been completely bypassed, Cheyenne today would be the major city in the Rocky Mountain region. And Denver would be what Cheyenne is. Cheyenne, I don't think they have total 100,000 people in the entire city. I think the city of Arvada, in terms of population, is bigger than the city of Cheyenne, Wyoming. Oh. So Cheyenne would be what Denver is, and Denver would be what Cheyenne is. It would be the Cheyenne Broncos, Wyoming Rockies, Cheyenne Nuggets, right? Wyoming Avalanche, right? They would have all of the stuff that Denver has, and Denver would be what Cheyenne is. Huh, how about that? Now, really quick, while we're talking about gold strikes, really quick. Do you guys know where the first gold strike was in Colorado? I'll wait for a minute and let you guys answer. No, it wasn't Denver. No, not Golden. Oh, Central City. That's a great guess, but it's wrong. The first gold strike in Colorado is Arvada. True story. True story. Arvada, 1859, is the first time that it's gold found in Colorado. So here's what happens. There's this prospector who's coming from the east, and he's on his way to California for the gold rush in California. And he stops at this creek to water his horse so his horse can drink some water and so on and so forth. And he figures, well, while I'm here, I might as well pan for some gold. And so while his horse is drinking out of this creek, he bends down, he bends panning for gold, and bam! Gold strike. He finds gold. Oh! And it happens to be Arvada, present day Arvada, Colorado. Now, you guys all know where this gold strike is. You just don't know that you know where the gold strike is. As you go down Sheridan Boulevard, just north of I-76, if you look to the west, just before I-76, west of Sheridan, there's this huge, like, white kind of suspension bridge that you'll see there. That suspension bridge marks the spot where this prospector first found gold in 1859 in what would become Arvada. Now, this prospector's name, you guys all know his name. You just don't know that you know his name. His name is Lewis Ralston. Ralston Road, Ralston Creek, Ralston Valley, right? That's the first gold strike in Arvada. And there's the huge white suspension bridge there just west of Sheridan, north of I-76, that marks that spot. And then there's a park just down from there, not far from that bridge, called Gold Strike Park, because that was the first gold strike. Oh, how about that? All right, let's talk about the Transcontinental Railroad. So remember, this is something that had been talked about by the United States for a long time, even before the Civil War. Remember, the United States even buys a tract of land down here in the very, very southern part of Arizona, the Gadsden Purchase, to complete the Transcontinental Railroad, because originally it was going to come out of New Orleans and go across here because this was fairly flat, right? And then things changed, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act and all that. So after the Civil War, the United States government has now said, "Yep, we got to build this transcontinental railroad." Okay. So there's two railroad companies that the government contracts with: the Central Pacific, which is going to come out of San Francisco and go east. And you can see on the map here the red. That's the Central Pacific. And then the Union Pacific, which is going to come out of Chicago and go west, and that's the blue here. Okay, so these are the two railroad companies: the Central Pacific coming from the west, going to the east, and the Union Pacific coming from the east and going west. Now, this railroad is built in large part by Irish and Chinese immigrants. Irish immigrants coming out of Chicago, Chinese immigrants coming out of San Francisco. Why do they have Chinese and Irish immigrants? Because there's a lot of them. That's why. And nobody liked them. Nobody liked the Irish or the Chinese, so it was hard for them to find jobs, and they would work for really, really cheap because they just wanted a job. So that's why they're the ones that build a railroad. During construction, they adopt what's known as the narrow gauge railroad. Narrow gauge railroad, all it does is it moves into rails. Okay, so the railroad, what they call standard gauge railroad, the rails of the railroad, the metal rails, are about 6 feet apart. On narrow gauge, they move them into 4.5 feet. Okay, and this becomes adopted as the new standard gauge um, railroad. Okay, we get 4.5 feet from 6 feet. Okay, the reason for this is because as they're coming across the Rocky Mountains here, or they're coming across the Sierra Madre Mountains out here, so they're coming across there, right? You got to blast and then you got to clear and then you got to level the ground, you got to lay down the tracks, and you got to repeat this process. It's faster and it's easier to make way for 4.5 feet than opposed to 6 feet. Okay. Now, this causes railroads obviously to build new trains, right? Because now their tires, their wheels of the train now have to come in, be 4.5 feet apart as opposed to 6 feet, right? Trust me, it would not be any fun to be on a train where its wheels are 6 feet across apart and then it goes onto a narrow gauge track. I mean, the train ride becomes much more exciting than you really wanted, right? So this is now the standard distance of rails for trains in the United States, 4.5 feet across, and that takes place during the Transcontinental Railroad. Another huge innovation that takes place during this time is standardized time. Okay, you get the time zones. You get all these different time zones that come up during the building of the railroad in the 1860s, 1870s. So here's what's happening. Okay, before the railroads, before 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. 1880s is really when we get the time zones get adopted. There was no time zone, right? Time zones were the exact same. The time was the exact same across the country. If it was 12 o'clock in New York City, it was also 12 o'clock in San Francisco. Okay. Now, when it takes forever to get somewhere, when you're on horseback, you're on wagon, and you're only going a couple of miles a day, that probably doesn't make much difference, right? It doesn't make any difference at all. When the sun was directly over your head, right? This is how they told time. When the sun was directly over your head, that was noon. Okay. Now, when we get railroads and you're able to move, to travel much faster, okay, this whole concept of when the sun is over your head, it's noon, doesn't work any longer. Because, say, from New York to Boston, which is really not that far, okay, the sun is directly over your head at different points from New York to Boston just because of the distance. So noon, necessarily, if you're this still standard you're going by, the sun is directly over your head. If this is still the same standard that you're going by in New York, okay, well, it's not noon in Boston then. And if you buy a train ticket and it says the train will arrive at 2:15 in the afternoon, well, is that 2:15 New York time? Is that 2:15 Boston time, depending on where the sun is? And then as you go further out, the time becomes even more problematic. So the railroads begin pushing Congress. Look, let's just divide up the country. Let's forget about the position of the sun in the sky. Let's just divide up the country into time zones so that in Boston and in New York and in Philadelphia and in Chicago, right? Noon is standardized. It's not dependent on where the sun is. Well, Congress being Congress, it takes them a long time to do anything, so they drag their feet. And so railroads just on their own create time zones to standardize time so that it becomes easier to know when the train's coming, when the train's leaving, so on and so forth. And that's where we get time zones from. Huh, how about that? All right, so hopefully As these two railroads are coming west and east, right? Or I'm sorry, east and west, right? Hopefully, if all the math works out, they will meet up at some point. And they do in Promontory Point, Utah. Luckily, the math worked out. Can you imagine? Like if they were off by a couple hundred feet and the Central Pacific is a couple hundred feet north and the Union Pacific all of a sudden comes in or a couple hundred feet south. You're like, oh, well, that didn't work, right? They got two different railroad lines, but it didn't work. It didn't happen. Luckily, they meet in the same place. Yay! And there's a big celebration right now. Great story, great story. So as these two trains, this is a picture here of when the two Transcontinental Railroad was finally completed, and the trains have come together, and they finally connected the country, by rail and so on and so forth. You can get on a train in New York City, and then you can get off the train in San Francisco. So great story how this comes about. So while they're waiting for the tracks to be completed, there's politicians and there's executives from the two railroad companies and investors and all these people. They're all there, right? And they're going to have a big party. While they're waiting for this to be completed, they're drinking. Okay. Now, to drive the last spike into the rail, they're going to use this ceremonial gold spike to signify the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And it's going to be this dignitary, this politician guy, who's going to drive the last spike. So they get done, they're ready for the last golden spike to be put into the rail to signify the completion of the railroad. Well, this guy's hammered out of his mind. He's just hammered. And now he's responsible for driving this gold spike into the rail, right? Can you imagine being the guy holding that gold spike? Like you're like watching this guy who can barely walk, and you're going, my hand was a good hand, right? You're just really nervous. So this guy goes to swing the sledgehammer above his head. Well, he's so drunk that he falls backwards with the sledgehammer, right? So they got to help him up, and it's pretty obvious this guy's just out of his skull, hammered. So they help him slowly tap into this gold spike, right? And then they celebrate and they pull out the gold spike and put in a regular spike, and yay, the railroad is done. So there you go. That's the story of the Transcontinental Railroad. All right. So being someone that lives on the frontier, this is a hard life. This is a really hard life, and it was a life that really people were not accustomed to at all. This was much different than being a frontiersman on the East Coast. Okay, they get out here. If you think back to the Homestead Act, one of the requirements is they had to build a permanent structure. Well, they get out here and they find really quick there's no trees. There's very few trees out here, which means there's not a lot of wood. And there's not any stones out here where they could build a stone house. There's not any big rocks out here for them to do that. So what they did, they were pretty ingenious, what they did to build a structure out here is that they used what there was a lot of. There was a lot of what they call buffalo grass. So they would cut sod about a foot and a half foot deep, and they would just cut these huge strips of sod, and then they would stack it on top of each other, and they would build a house literally made out of dirt. It's called a soddy. You can see a picture there, and you can see, if you look really close, you can see the stacks of sod just stacked on top of one another. Okay? And this is really a pretty ingenious method of doing this, right? In the winter time or in the summertime, the dirt, the soil kept the house fairly cool. In the wintertime, the soil would help insulate the house and would keep it fairly warm, would keep heat inside the house. So that was pretty ingenious. Okay. Now there are other problems as you're digging up, right? You get lots and lots of bugs. Bugs are a constant problem. Sometimes you would dig up a snake nest, and it was not uncommon, right? You'd be eating dinner and snakes come out of the walls and drop out of the ceiling and stuff. That wasn't uncommon. We're always dirty, right? They're made out of dirt, so they're always dirty. And if you got a lot of rain or you got a lot of snow, the walls would turn into mud. Oof. Now, because there's also not a lot of wood out here, they had to figure out ways to create fires to cook and keep warm. So they would burn old clothes, they would dry out grass, they would take horse or cattle or buffalo dung, poop, and they would dry that out and they would burn that for the fires. Another problem living out here is the weather and the isolation, right? Weather was a constant problem. You guys live here, right? We can have incredibly hot summers, which cause wildfires, which is a big problem. Um, During the winter, we can get some brutal blizzards in really cold temperatures. That we can have blizzards all the way into May, right? So weather was a big problem. You have flash floods and wildfires and blizzards and so on and so forth. And also, right, there's not a lot of people out here, so you're pretty isolated. So it was really hard um, to connect with other people, and it was really hard to get supplies that you needed out here. So there are some innovations that take place to address these problems. One of the first things one of the first big innovations is what's known as the RFD. Okay, stands for Rural Free Delivery. It's basically a mail service. And it's still around in some very rural parts of Colorado and other places around the country where it's pretty rural. Um, so, what it is that it was people, just average everyday people, who would volunteer to periodically go deliver people's mail. Right. And they still have that today. The mail would come into some sort of central post office. Whoever this person is that volunteers to be the mail delivery person goes into that post office. They collect the mail, they pick up the mail that's been sent to the central post office, and then they take it out into the rural parts of the area and deliver that mail. Okay, and that still happens today. This was a huge innovation back then, which helps address a lot of the isolation and a lot of the problems with getting materials because, this is a volunteer mail system. That's what I just told you. Okay. Now, correspondence, news, which is very difficult to get any news about anything that was going on, and even now you could even have things delivered to your house, which was a big problem back then. You could to get supplies for your house, you'd have to go into town. And depending where you lived, town could be a day or 2 days journey away. So you didn't go there all that often. Now with the rural free delivery, you can have things delivered directly to you, once a week, maybe once every other week or so. And Montgomery Ward creates this guy by the name of Montgomery Ward creates a catalog that would be sent out that could be sent out on the RFD to settlers. And then the settlers could go through the catalog and they could order things from Montgomery Ward and then it would be delivered to their house. Just like it was like a modern day internet, right? It was just the internet of their day. What could you get out of this catalog? You could get anything you wanted, right? Here's a catalog, Montgomery Ward catalog, spring and summer 1895. This would be delivered by the RFD out to these guys in the Saudis and whatever. So you could get hats and clothing. You could get furniture, right? I mean, look at the prices on these rockers, right? $298, right? 462, is it 418? You could buy a couch for $9, right? You could buy furniture; it would be delivered to you. Buy basic utensils. You could buy shavers, the razors, just basic utensils that you need for everyday living. You could buy guns. You could buy ammunition from them. You could buy a house, an entire house. They would sell you these plans. They would then included in the plans would be all of the material that you need, all of the screws, all of the nails, all of the wood, all of the everything that you needed to build this house, and instructions on how to do it. And so you would look through the Montgomery Ward catalog and they would show you, right? This is what this house looks like. Here's the floor plans, right? And you could buy all of this for under, $1,100. And it would be delivered to you. You didn't have to go get it. They would bring it to your house and you could build this house. True story. Now, These houses today, they're called mail order houses, and Montgomery Ward had them. Sears eventually sold houses. J.C. Penney's eventually sold houses in their catalogs. These houses today are now like collector's items. They're very, 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 very valuable houses if you can find these houses built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. In fact, if you guys know Christmas Story, the story of Christmas Story, right? The house in Christmas Story with Ralphie and all that. That house that they filmed it, that was a mail order house. Oh, and you could get all of this, delivered to you from a catalog. Okey smoky. Another fixture of life on the West is the American cowboy, right? You guys know what an American cowboy looks like. Now, much of what we know about the American cowboy, much of what we has been developed in folklore and legend and so on and so forth in um, American society about the cowboy really is adopted from Mexican cowboys. They're known as vaqueros. Okay? So here's what happens. Right after the Civil War, beef becomes a staple of the American diet. Prior to the Civil War, Americans didn't eat a lot of beef. They ate it every once in a while, but it definitely was not the main meat that they ate. Following the Civil War, beef becomes a staple of the American diet. So now, as more and more Americans are eating beef, cattle ranching becomes a very lucrative, becomes a very, very profitable business endeavor. And so cattle ranching begins to dominate the Western plains. And to take care of these huge herds of cattle out on the ranches, we get cowboys. And cowboys adopted a lot of what they know from the Mexican vaqueros, who were all over the American Southwest, what would become the American Southwest. Um, the Mexicans also had cattle ranching. They used beef a lot, so they had a lot of cattle ranching. And the vaqueros were the ones who came up with a lot of what we know about the American cowboy, about how to do cattle ranching and how to take care of the cattle. Okay, so everything that we know about the American cowboy really comes from the vaquero. I mean everything. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things about American cowboys that we get from the vaqueros, right? You have the cowboy hat, right? Well, the cowboy hat really is developed and adopted in large part from the sombrero, which the vaqueros would wear. The American just changed the sombrero a little bit. Instead of having just a wide brim all the way around, right? The American cowboy pushes up the sides a little bit, and they pull down the front, pull down the back. Now, the reason for this is there's a reason, right? Everything on the cowboy has a reason. There's a very valid reason for the cowboys. Um, the vaqueros had very wide brims on the sombrero to keep the sun out of their eyes and off of their heads. But one of the problems with the sombreros, right? If it rained, all of a sudden you got a bird bath on your head. So the cowboys push up the sides and pull down the front. Same reason, keep the sun out of their eyes, keep the sun off their heads, and so on and so forth. But they push up the sides and they pull down the front and back to create like a channel for the water to run off of their hat so it doesn't just collect in their hat. Vaqueros wear a scarf around their neck. Cowboys wear a scarf around their neck. And the reason for the scarf is to keep dirt from going down your shirt. And also, if you get into a dust storm and there's a lot of dust being kicked up, you can pull the scarf up over your nose. Like, we wear our mask now in the Rona world. Pull the mask up over your nose and it keeps you from breathing in the dirt. Long sleeve shirt, you always wear a long sleeve shirt. Vaqueros did, cowboys adopt the same thing. Keep the sun off of your arms so you don't get sunburned. Then you have chaps. Vaqueros had very, very wide, very ornate chaps, a lot of silver, a lot of fringe on the chaps. Now, the purpose of the chaps, there's a couple of different purposes for the chaps. One was to keep your pants from being being rubbed through as you rode on the saddle, right? The saddle, as you rode a horse, would rub against your pants, and it would, put holes in your pants. So the chaps help protect the pants from being worn out. Also, the chaps as you're riding through tall grass, kept stickers and stuff from getting stuck into your pants. As you're riding through water, you're riding through snow, it kept your pants dry, the chaps did. Now, vaquero chaps tended to be much wider than American cowboy chaps, and they had a lot more fringe, a lot more detail on them. But the cowboys adopted chaps from Mexican vaqueros. Cowboy saddles were adopted, and American saddles are different than, say, English or European saddles. The most notable difference is American saddles tend to be bigger, just like vaquero saddles. Vaquero saddles are much bigger than American saddles. So the American cowboy saddle is like in between the vaquero and the European riding saddle. European riding saddle is just a very simple leather seat that you would put on a horse. The cowboys make it a little bit bigger, so it's maybe a little more comfortable. And they also add a horn to the front of the American saddle that the European saddles didn't have. And the horn, the purpose of the horn was that when you were lassoing cattle, runaway cattle, or you're lassoing a cattle to brand, you could wrap the other end of the rope or the lariat around that horn, and you would train the horse to stop, and it would hold that cattle in place while you got off to go tie it up or brand it or whatever. American cowboys borrow cowboy boots, right? They developed cowboy boots. And again, it's kind of in between European riding boots and vaquero boots. Vaquero boots tend to be much more ornate, much more pointy in the toe, and a little bit higher heel. The American cowboy boot has a much more pronounced heel than a European riding boot, but not as high as a vaquero boot. And they're not as pointy and are not as ornate as the vaquero boots would be. But again, they serve a purpose. The heel is angled a little bit, so that way you can put it into the stirrups and you can ride. You can get that stirrup stuck up in the heel there, and you can ride at very high rates of speed without falling off, and so on and so forth. So everything on the American cowboy is adopted from the vaquero. It's not as pronounced. The spurs. Vaquero spurs are very large spurs. American cowboy spurs are not as large, but they serve the same purpose to kind of kick the horse and get the horse to go a little bit faster. So everything that we know about the American cowboy and the way that they round up cattle and move cattle around, all of that is adopted from the Mexican vaqueros who were in the American Southwest before the American cowboy showed up. All right, so beginning the 1870s, they begin to do these cattle drives. And again, the railroad plays into this, right? Railroads would come into what became known as cow towns: Abilene, Kansas; Dodge City, Kansas; Kansas City; Cheyenne; Denver. I think I just spelled Cheyenne wrong. How about that? So what they would do is they would drive the cattle up out of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, southern Colorado, Texas. They would do these cattle drives once a year into these cow towns. And the reason they would do that is because from the slaughterhouses back east, primarily Chicago, stock buyers would come in on the railroad to these cow towns because they knew the cattle drive was coming in. The cowboys, the ranchers knew that the stock buyers would be there at the same time, certain time every year. So they would do these cattle drives up out of the Southwest into these cow towns and basically sell their cows to these what would you call them, butchers, or guys who own the stockyards back in Chicago. Then they would buy the cows, they would load the cows up in the railroad, and then they would take the cows back to Chicago to be slaughtered or to be bred to create more beef, right? This is where cattle drives come from. They would drive the herd up into these cow towns, knowing that there were beef buyers from back east came in on the railroad, sell their cattle to them. They would take the cattle back to Chicago, mostly slaughter them, breed them, whatever. And the cowboys would go back and restart the whole process again. Now, there's something in Denver that's kind of a remnant of this. You all know about it. You just don't know about it, right? that you know about it. And that's the stock show, right? The stock show is a continuation of this practice when cowboys would drive their cattle and other livestock, sheep and whatever else, into Denver when meat buyers would come in um, to buy this year's stock and put it on the train and then take it back, right? And the stock show is a remnant of that. That's the purpose of the stock show. All right, so cattle ranchers, they would use what was known as open range, meaning that they would just let their cattle roam wherever. There was nobody's property. It was just open. And wherever the cattle went to eat, that's what they did. Okay. Now the problem was keeping track of whose cattle was whose cows was whose. So this is where branding comes in, right? Every ranch would have their own brand that they would put on the cattle, signifying that this cow belongs to this rancher and this cow belongs to that rancher. And that's how they were able to separate out herds in the open range. Okay. Now, pretty soon, there become some real conflicts between cattle and sheep ranchers because both cattle and sheep eat the same thing. They both eat the same grass. And sheep ranching was becoming very popular because of the wool, and there were people that ate sheep as well. And sheep were not as expensive as cattle. So you begin to get some competing interests between sheep ranchers and cattle ranchers, and they're all out in the open range and they're all eating the same grass, right? And this causes what are known as range wars between cattle and sheep ranchers. And cattle ranchers and sheep ranchers would hire local gunfighters, local criminals, whatever, as their own personal militia to go out and attack their rivals to drive them off the land so their cattle or their sheep can eat, or go kill each other's cattle and sheep to drive them off of the grass. Okay. Now, farmers are kind of stuck in between all of this because farmers are just trying to grow their crops, and the cattle and sheep come in and they trample their crops and are eating, and then they got the range wars. So farmers hated all of this, right? But they didn't have a way to keep the sheep or the cattle out of their crops, out of their land. Okay. The problem with this was that there was fencing. There was really no way to put up fencing because, again, there's not any wood out here. There's not any large stones to build a stone fence like they could back in Europe. This was a real problem for the farmers. And then in 1873, this guy by the name of Joseph Glidden solves the problem. He comes up with a very simple process of taking two strands of wire and twisting it. And intermittently in the strands of wire, you would just take another piece of wire and twist it in between the two strands and make these barbs. Okay, and he makes barbed wire. And barbed wire all of a sudden catches on. It's pretty cheap. It's cheap to make, so it's cheap to buy. It doesn't get burned in wildfires. It doesn't get knocked down in a blizzard. It doesn't get swept away in a flash flood. You need very minimal wood, or you can get metal stakes and stake it into the ground. And it's very easy to use. It's very quick to put up. And it begins to cordon off the land. And animals learn really quick, right? Ooh, barbed wire, no good, right? Barbed wire, do bad stuff. You begin getting different types of barbed wire begins popping up around the country. There's different patents and stuff, and you can see some of the different barbed wire that begins to come up. But this was a huge innovation because now people now could fence off their land to prevent other animals from trampling their crops or other people from getting into their property or whatever, or just simply showing where your property was and where other people's property was. This solved a big problem. There's no wood. It doesn't get burned up, doesn't get knocked down, doesn't get swept away, and it's pretty cheap and it's pretty simple. So barbed wire was a huge part in helping settle the West. All right, here we go. Closing of the frontier. So here's what happens. As more and more people began to move west and take advantage of the Homestead Act and begin moving further and further west, eventually there's less and less and less land to be settled. Big problem. There's still a lot of people coming that are looking for land, and there's no land to have, except maybe one place. This land that was set aside by Andy Jackson during the Trail of Tears, the Indian Territory. Remember, this was given to the Indians, and it was promised that this would be theirs for as long as the grass grows and the wind blows, right? Nobody, and the reason was there wasn't a white man in his right mind who was ever going to want to live here. Well, now that there's less and less land available in the West, people want to live here because they just want land. So these people begin pushing, settlers begin putting pressure on Congress to open up the Indian Territory for settlement. Oh boy. So these people are known as boomers because they want to go in and they want to set up these boom towns and go into the Indian Territory and set up settlements in boom towns. So they're known as boomers. Okay. So the government finally caved in and they agreed. They'll go into the Indian Territory and they will divide up 12,000 different 160-acre plots of land. So there's going to be 160-acre plots of land, just like in the Homestead Act. Same thing, right? First come, first serve. The first one there, you get to settle it, you get to live there, so on and so forth. There'll be 12,000 of these created out of the Indian Territory. This land is going to be opened up at noon on April 22nd, 1889. Okay. Ho, ho, ho. So in the weeks leading up to the 22nd, 50 to 100,000 people begin to show up and ring the perimeter of the Indian Territory, just raring to go, right? I mean, they're just excited to get in there and get a piece of land, right? So this is probably like the first time, and this is probably the last time that anybody was excited about getting into Oklahoma, right? I mean, they just can't wait. And there's people there, they've got wagons full of like everything to build a house. There's people on horseback, and there's people just on foot who are just raring to get in there. At noon, they fire the cannons, and there's this cloud of red dust that's kicked up as people are literally running across the border into what will become Oklahoma to find these plots of land. And they get to the plot of land, and how they know they can claim it, there's a flag, and they get a flag, and the flag has a number, right? And that is that plot of land. It corresponds with that plot of land. They've got to go down. They've got to pay like a $5 filing fee with the federal government that this is their plot of land, that they've claimed it, right? So it's a first come, first served basis. So these people are just running, right? There's clouds of dust flying up, and it's just craziness. Now, there's a problem. As people are running through the territory, they very quickly realize there's people that got there before they were supposed to. They've already planted crops. They've already built houses. It's obvious they've broken the rules, and they got there before they were supposed to. They got there sooner than they were supposed to, and these people are called Sooners. Have you ever wondered? I mean, just for time out, fool. Have you ever wondered why the University of Oklahoma is called the Sooners? Oh, there you go. This is why history's cool, y'all. They name history after or universities after historical events. Oh, this is why history's cool, right? These people are called Sooners because they got there, they broke the rules, and they got there before they were supposed to. Now the University of Oklahoma, they're known as the Sooners. Oklahoma is known as the Sooner State, right? When University of Oklahoma, the fight song for University of Oklahoma is Boomer Sooner. Oh! Right? Boomers want to set up boom towns. Sooners, because they got there before they were supposed to. When the University of Oklahoma football team scores a touchdown, there's this little covered wagon that comes out and they shoot this rifle, right? Signifying the land rush that takes place. Oh, see, that's why history's cool, y'all. Oh, that's so cool. Oh, that's just, see, aren't you glad you know this stuff now? All of this makes so much more sense, right? All right, so by the beginning of June, all of the land in Oklahoma and all of the rest of the land across the West has been claimed, and the frontier has been closed. And this long journey that the United States has been on, this drive to dominate this landmass from sea to shining sea, has now been realized. We've done it. The United States now controls all of the land from sea to shining sea. And there's a picture of the land rush as it takes place. You can see all the guys running towards the newly opened land. So now we've fulfilled manifest destiny. And now that we've conquered this landmass, now our attention turns not necessarily to the west in constant expansion. Our attention now begins to turn inward. Now, how do we make this country as fruitful and as profitable as it could be, should be, will be? The way that Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay and Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, all of these guys thought was possible. Now that we've conquered the land, now what do? How do we build ourselves up from here? And there you go. That's the end of the closing of the frontier. From here, we're going to build up the economy. Maybe not in the best way, but we'll do it. All right, that's it. Take care. Make sure you guys turn in your notes, and I'll see you soon.